Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Corporate Governance Committee. Just as a reminder for everyone, if you can be aware that the meeting is being live streamed via the Council's YouTube channel, which means that you will appear on camera at certain points. Even if you're not speaking, the camera may pan across the room, so you will appear. I do just want to welcome some people this evening to the meeting. First of all, Rob Edwards, the new Democratic Services Officer, who has joined us this evening. We also have Claire and Julio from Ernst & Young. We have Dan from RSM. Suzanne is here to my right. We have Sharon, and we also have Michelle at the opposite end of the table. So welcome to you all. First thing then, apologies. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Councillor Wells.
Thank you very much. Moving on to minutes of the previous meeting. Is everyone in agreement that I sign the minutes of the meeting held on the 25th of March and the 15th of May? Yeah. Thank you. Item 2, members' interests. Is there anybody that needs to or wishes to declare anything this evening? No, thank you very much. Item 3, unaudited statement of accounts. I will be handing over to Suzanne, who will introduce this item for us.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, everybody. I am very pleased to be presenting to the committee the unaudited statement of accounts. It would be very remiss of me not, first of all, to thank both my colleague service managers, but particularly the finance team, for the hard work in actually achieving this position. You may remember that in years gone by, we had a deadline of the end of May by which we had to publish an audited statement of accounts. That for this year is actually by the 30th of June. So we are actually, as the fact that they were out with your pack papers, met that timetable extensively, and that is a tribute to very much the hard work. So we have here the draft accounts and also a draft annual governance statement. And I'm sure Claire from EY won't mind me mentioning that actually the work has already commenced on the audit, which they're able to do irrespective of when the accounts have been published, because a lot of the work is actually assurance work. So we are pleased that that has also commenced. I won't regurgitate what's in the report and actually what was presented as part of the outturn report about the financial position, other than to commend these to you and that you consider and approve them as drafts. Clearly, they can be amended, as you'll recall from last municipal year, but also then there is the notice to approve the publication, which also then we open the opportunity for inspection of those accounts for a set period of time, which we will do in line with when we have staff available taking account of immediate holidays. So, Chairman, that's all I wanted to say at this point in time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I'm going to take that as a... No, nothing from either side? No? Okay. So, Councillor Taylor. Can you pop your microphone on? Thank you.
Okay, sorry. So unaudited accounts, on item number 3, the appendix 1. Are we on that yet? Are we good for this? I've got a question when it comes to the annual governance statement. I think it says on paragraph 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Council's financial management arrangements are largely consistent with the governance requirements. largely consistent? Should they not be consistently, all of it rather than just largely? It's a strange word to use for me.
Thank you for that question, Councillor Taylor. We generally say largely, just in case there is anything that comes along that says, actually, this stuff we could do better. I don't believe there are any significant things that are not in line with the governance requirements. However, each chief financial officer has the ability to do things to meet the local need as well. But in broad terms, I believe we comply with the code of conduct. We certainly comply with the regulations, but actually I am of the view one can never say 100%. So I would say that might largely consistent. If you ask me to put a percentage on it, I would say I'm 99% certain. So that would be why I would never want to be, because in the event that something's found, I'd look even more foolish to say in writing that. However, ultimately it's signed by the leader and the chief executive, and if either of them particularly felt strongly that they would want me to be more fulsome, then I would happily change what I've drafted here.
Councillor Gray.
Are we looking at the annual governance statement, Chair, at this point in time, or are we just looking at the unaudited accounts? Looking at all of it, right? Okay. If I may, then, just a couple of questions about the governance statement. I see the creation of a risk and controls group, and I'm not certain that I knew much about the risk and controls group, so can somebody tell me what it is, who's on it, what its remit is, and how it's helping this committee, presumably, on the way through?
I would have to come back with you exactly who's on it. What I will say to you is it hasn't met as frequently as it historically did, and that's partly because we don't have our own risk officer. We've been doing work using CLT governance with the input from risk. But in terms of who's on it, I think it was established back at the early part of 24-25. I think with the risk officer we had leaving us, it hasn't been as frequent, but I have to bring you more details. I'm afraid I don't have them in my head.
Did you want to come back?
Yeah, and a supplementary. So firstly, I welcome that, because I think it's important, given the situation that we find ourselves in, that we do understand fully how all of these pieces are working together. We've obviously got internal audit, which is now being externally provided. No problem with that, by the way. But what I welcome is that the government's governance statement does acknowledge the situation that we find ourselves in. I think it's good from that point of view, Chair. I think it sets that out very clearly. I suppose one of the questions that I've got about, so when you look down there and you look at sort of progress on governance issues identified in 24-25, that's I'm currently on page, whatever it is, doesn't actually tell me what page I'm on, 5 of 14 of the report, but I've no idea what that means for the big pack. But it's down the bottom with regards to, it's at the end of the item after significant governance issues, and then goes on to talk about progress on governance issues identified during the course of the year. It's page 19, I'm being told, from my left. So if we work, the person I need to talk to is Suzanne here, I think. You're on it. So there's governance issues that we've identified, and quite helpfully it sort of says what the action plan is, what progress has been made, are we carrying it forward? When you go on to the following page, and it talks about internal audit, talks about the various things that are happening. It's down there, it's not an issue to kind of carry forward. Can you just explain to me why all of that? Is it because the external assessment is now not overdue, and that's why we're not carrying it forward?
The reason we're not carrying that one forward is because it particularly related to the external quality assessment that was done when we had our previous arrangements. Now that we've replaced those arrangements working with RSM, and Dan can speak a bit more in terms of how they've assessed the compliance with standards. We don't need to carry it forward into this year because our provision of internal audit is different, so we don't need to address those issues. They've been overtaken by the fact we've got a different model for internal audit at the current point in time.
If I may, through you, Chair, yeah, just to add to that, I think that's right, what Suzanne says, and I think what we've demonstrated, and I can come on to just talk a little bit in detail about this in my annual report, is not only will we be compliant with the required standards in the 25-26 financial year, but a number of the other recommendations that were made in the EQA sort of gap analysis review, they are actively being sort of dealt with as a result of our appointment. So, for example, training to the two individuals within the in-house team has already occurred on a couple of dates in the first quarter. They continue to be supervised actively by my team. So a couple of those issues were explicitly pulled out and have already been addressed.
Any other final comments or questions on this? Councillor Shaw.
Thank you. My question was actually related to the same question that Councillor Gray asked regarding the risk controls group. It says that we have appointed a risk controls officer. Has that actually happened? Because I noticed on the website that there was still a position advertised.
I think I need to potentially reword some of that. We are actually, the advert closes in a couple of weeks, and that's what I was referring to in answer to my question to Councillor Gray, that we did have one. They came for a while, they left us, unfortunately, and so we are replacing that individual, and then we can reinvigorate that work that was being done. But I will look back as to who was previously on that group and how it worked. But actually, I think there's a place for us to bring that back as we redevelop our, refresh our risk approach.
Okay. Councillor Gray.
So as a follow-up to Councillor Shaw's question, may I ask if the training that was delivered to the person who's now no longer with us, or was that training delivered to other people?
Yeah, sorry, so the training that I was referencing is to the substantive members that are still within the in-house internal audit team that we are overseeing their work, but have also provided training. So that is in relation to sort of a different post to, I think, the query that was about a risk and controls officer. What I was referencing was the internal auditors within the in-house team. So two separate posts.
Did you want to come in?
If I may, by explanation, the Risk and Controls Officer reports directly to the new Head of Service who's starting at the end of the month. Internal audit is separate to that. So that's the role that's being recruited to. It's been vacant since I joined the council. So that's why the training's only gone to the internal audit staff. The risk training will come from the work we're doing separately on risk with RSM, and they've been supporting in terms of helping to frame the new role, and also then they will provide some training and mentoring, which is part of the support that we have on risk management from RSM, a separate team to the internal audit team. So hopefully that's been helpful in clarifying.
Councillor Hodgson-Jones.
Thank you. Sorry, on the same point, I have a question now. I'm a little confused. Is our internal audit provided by internal staff employed by the council, or is it provided by RSM? And if it's both, how does that work?
I'll start and perhaps Dan can come in. I think as we've explained previously, the management and leadership of internal audits provided by Dan and his colleague Alistair Foster. They have some of their own auditors, but also we still have 2 of ours employed, and they work under the supervision of Alistair on a day-to-day basis, Dan on a more senior basis. They're receiving the same sort of training now as colleagues who work directly for RSM. So we have a mixed model. So from a pay and rations point of view, signing their annual leave, I do that currently. The new head of service will do that when they come. So we look after their well-being and welfare, but their training and guidance as far as on the day job comes from the leadership of RSM.
Thank you. You answered my supplementary.
Okay, any final questions or comments? Nope. Okay, so we're going to move forward then. The recommendation that we have here is to approve the annual governance statement, the unaudited statement of accounts for 24-25, and the notice of publication. Do we have anyone happy to propose? Yep. A seconder? Yeah. And a show of hands? Yep. It's unanimous. Thank you very much. Moving on to item 4, the External Auditor's Annual Planning Report for 24-25. Claire is now going to introduce this report for us.
Thank you, Chair. So I think we promised at the last committee that we would circulate the report in advance, and I believe Suzanne has done that. So you've had quite a long while to look through it. I think the one thing that I did want to pull out, and then happy Julia and I can take any questions on the report, is the bit in the executive summary that talks about rebuilding of assurance and are waiting for guidance from the National Audit Office around the rebuilding of assurance around reserves. I'm pleased to say that guidance was released last week, so we are now working through that as a firm in terms of what the implications will be for the audit and how quickly we can get back to a clean opinion. And when we present our audit results report to you on conclusion of the audit, in there we are hoping to have a table that sets out this is what the timeline is in line with the National Audit Office, and this is where you are as an authority. I think the really positive for me that's come out of that guidance is there's not a one size fits all. There's actually some risk assessment in there as well. So given that you only missed one disclaimed opinion, you only had one disclaimed year, we had a relatively good audit last year, we'll factor all of that into the level of work that we need to do over the historical reserves position. But like I say, once we've worked through that, we'll be able to take management and yourselves through what any additional work will look like. But then happy just to take questions on any element of the report.
Thank you. Do we have any questions or comments? Councillor Jennings.
Thank you, Chair. And it does really relate to that part, unsurprisingly. And I think it was I just want to get some clarity, really, because it talks quite a lot about getting reasonable assurance over closing balances. It signposts that you're unable to obtain sufficient evidence this year to have reasonable assurance over balances. And it does talk about closing balances for this year. Are we talking about the closing balances for this year, or are we talking about the opening balances, i.e. the closing balances from last year?
So if we think about the statement of financial position, so all of your top half things like your debtors, your creditors, your cash, we can audit all of that and get assurance over the closing balance. We completed most of our audit work on that last year, so we have assurance over the opening balances, therefore we have assurance over the movement in year. The area on the top half of the balance sheet where we perhaps don't have the level of assurance is around the PPE valuations, and that's because of the cyclical nature of those, and there is an element in there of the disclaimed opinion that we haven't yet audited. So if we're looking at the balance sheet, top half of the balance sheet, actually we expect we will have full assurance over all of the closing balances, and we'll present you a dashboard similar to what we did last year. The rebuild guidance where we talk about the opening position that we can't get assurance over it's largely due to reserves. And if this was a corporate audit, it would be really straightforward. If it was a company and you didn't have the disaggregation between usable and unusable reserves that we have in local government, the work that we'll be doing I can't commit, but probably over the course of the next 12 months to rebuild that assurance will be what happened in that disclaimed year that may suggest the opening balance of the reserves could be materially misstated. We'll direct our work there to rebuild assurance over the closing balance. Now, there are some reserves in there where actually just by auditing the top half of the balance sheet that we probably do have assurance over, but those like your evaluations and anything impacted by your capital adjustments, we just need to work through a bit more. But it's really difficult to talk through. We're trying to develop some nice graphics to come to you in the audit results reports when we get there, so we can quite clearly show not only what assurance you have this year, but how that's progressed and what additional assurance you have compared to last year as well.
Of course.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that response. On the next page, it then talks about that you're going to your audit approach is to look at the closing balance sheet in a similar way to you looked at it last year, which I guess subject to what you've just said really was started making me think that if the approach last year wasn't able to give us enough assurance on those closing balances to be able to give an opinion, then the same approach is just going to lead to the same thing this year. And therefore, at what point is that approach going to change? Is this something that's going to come from the guidance that you're working through at the moment to know at what point we will be able to get enough assurance on all of the balances, top and bottom half,
Yes.
in order to give an opinion? Or is that just a question that is impossible to answer?
No, it's not impossible to answer. It is really quite techie, but I've been through this many times, so I'll try my best to explain in simple language. So we have the disclaimed opinion, which meant that when we started our audit, I was getting my years confused, but when we started our audit for 23-24, we had no assurance over those opening balances the 1st of April 2023. What we were able to do was audit most of the top half of the balance sheet and get assurance over those closing balances. So if you remember, we had a dashboard in our audit results report last year, and that set out where we get the assurance there. We could get assurance over some closing balances, but because we had that disclaimed opinion, we didn't have the assurance over the opening balances, which means that we couldn't have assurance over any of the in-year movements. So there was a big gap in assurance there this year. When we step forward a year, we've got those balances that we got assurance over last year. We'll hopefully get assurance over those balances this year, which means we have assurance over the in-year movement. So it's really just the opening balances in the comparator for a lot of the things that are still a bit of an issue, as well as this reserves. So the National Audit Office guidance, which is available, focuses on the rebuild back of reserves because everything else should roll out naturally by the time we've effectively completed the audit of 3 balance sheets fully. But like I say, we'll try and, well, not try, we are developing something that will try and set that out in a nice format for you to come in with our final reporting.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Gray.
Thank you very much, Chair. If we can move off sort of macro issues, which affect sort of everybody, to more local issues, so value for money, which obviously caused quite a lot of excitement last year. And you've obviously got a section on this, so I'm in the value for money section on your report, which I think starts on page 20 of your report. So, 148, and he's telling me of the main report. Sorry, 146. New information coming in from my left. So the question I've got for you there really is, when I read this, it looks like you're sort of still developing the areas and the themes that you're going to look at, whereas earlier on you've got some specific audit focuses around leases and various other things that are there. I'm curious to know what areas you're going to focus in on. We clearly know internal audit was part of the issue for last year, so that's clearly going to be a big focus of it. But obviously I'm very alive to the fact that, and we've been raising this for months at this panel, that we've got a new Procurement Act, and at the moment we're minus a procurement head of procurement. We're still trying to recruit into that post at this point in time. So I would be sitting here, or I think I would be sitting in your place rather, thinking, is everything okay in the world of procurement, the new Procurement Act? Is that something that's kind of still developing in your mind as to what it is that you're going to look at? And if so, when are you going to clarify exactly what you expect to look at from a value for money perspective?
So, in terms of our responsibilities for value for money, it is it's quite broad and at a high level. It's about the arrangements that the council has in place. So we will consider new legislation. We will consider the arrangements. You know, we review all the minutes. We have discussions with officers to identify those risk areas. I have to say that hasn't come up in our risk assessment now. It's not to say that following this conversation I'm not going to go back and have a look at it, but as you say, the key significant weakness that risk of significant weakness that we've identified this year is around the governance arrangements because of the weakness we had last year in internal audit arrangements. Now I know there's an awful lot of work gone on since we reported that, and as well as part of that we need to reflect on actually management knew there was a weakness, but they've been doing all of these actions, and what does that mean for an opinion? So because there's a risk of significant weakness there, that doesn't automatically lead to the fact that we're going to report a weakness at the end.
If I can just bring in Suzanne.
Chair and committee, if I may say, we have had an interim procurement manager in, and that appointment lasts until September. We're about to go out for a permanent role at that level. We have already secured 2 new permanent procurement officers who started with us on the 28th of April. That was in addition to one who started with us. She's been with us now about 9 months. So, and that's on top of the fact we do have some admin support in that team. So we have significantly increased the substantive roles in that area and been successful in recruiting some high caliber individuals. And next task is to go out for a permanent procurement manager. So we have done that over the last 6 or 7 months.
Councillor Gray.
So obviously that's very reassuring and is in line with the kind of things that we have seen you do, Suzanne, since you arrived. But this audit goes back to April the 1st, 2024, which predates that activity. Yeah. And so one of the questions I'm flagging up here is, you know, can we have confidence that we have been procuring in the way that we should have been, and consequently using public money and managing public money in the best way possible? So I've made my point. I'll leave it with you, and you know, we'll hear in due course.
Yeah, I think to take your point, but I do just want to clarify that we wouldn't, as part of this work, we wouldn't perform a review of procurement, because that's not what the scope of our work does. We have very specific criteria in terms of the National Audit Office, so we wouldn't perform an investigation into procurement as such, but we will take away your comments and have a think about how it would feed into our responsibilities.
Dan, can I just bring you in here?
Sorry, just to say we have got a procurement audit in the 25/6 internal audit programme.
Thank you. Any further comments, or Councillor Taylor?
Thank you. So, Claire, I'm not an accountant by trade by any means. I have an accountant to do the work for me. So, I've got a question. In the it's on page 15. You refer to something called revenue expenditure. I always thought you had revenue or expenditure. You know, it's income or outgoings. But how do you have it both? Or is it the same thing?
It's a term that's commonly used in local government accounting, but what it means is effectively we're saying revenue expenditure is expenditure that's not capital in nature. So it's not expenditure on like your property, plant and equipment additions or anything like that. It is expenditure that is your general costs of running of your services, is the way we refer to it.
So would wages come into that then?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Jennings.
Thank you, Joe. It's actually a question that's probably either for Suzanne or for Sharon, actually, but it's about the new inherent risk of the adoption of IFRS 16. I'd just be interested to know, because, you know, in the commercial world, it's a significant bit of work reclassifying operating leases as finance leases. I'd just be interested to know how many leases did we have to reclassify? Not, you know, just broad terms, and how much work did that involve?
Who would like to answer that? Sharon? Yeah.
In answer to your question, Councillor, we didn't know what we didn't know at the beginning of the year, so there's been extensive work done by our Treasury and Capital Accountant to identify any leases that are actually within the council. We have very few that would come under the IFRS 16 banner, because there are lots of exemptions like small leases and what have you. So we've done all the work. All of that will be passed through to the auditors, because as you can imagine, it's a new standard. They're going to be crawling all over it. But in terms of the numbers, very, very few.
Thank you, everyone. So we have a recommendation, which is to note the auditor's annual planning report set out in Appendix 1. Is everyone happy to note that? Yep. Thank you very much. Item 5, internal audit update report. So Dan, I'm going to hand over to you for this, please.
Thank you, Chair. If I may take members to page 177 of the pack, that's the key messages section. So this sort of predominantly focuses on the 24/5 plan and the really the finalisation of that. So page 177 confirms 4 final reports issued since the last meeting. The opinions are shown on that page there. We'd also issued the final report, the final draft report. That's on the Cyber Essentials readiness. At the time of preparing the paper, it was a draft report. It has since been finalised. So that completes the programme of work, or the revised programme of work that was brought to you both at the sort of February and March meetings. So positive in that sense that we've obviously completed the schedule of work. You will then see on pages 179 and 180 of the pack the sort of bullet point summaries there, the sort of the conclusions from those 4 reviews. So we've got the one limited assurance there on the commercial estate rents review, advisory review on home and hybrid working, and then the 2 positive opinions on the remaining 2 reviews. Appendix A then obviously just summarises all of the work that was completed in 24/5, and I think importantly, given there's been some sort of questions on this tonight in terms of some of the forward-looking, at Appendix B on page 183, you can see we've already completed 1 review from the 25/6 plan, so a draft report on recruitment and retention. 5 reviews are sort of field work in progress, and then we've got 2 further audits starting in the latter part of June, in July and in August. So we've made a good start to the 25/6 programme, and realistically in the September meeting you should be receiving quite a fulsome number of final reports from the 25/6 plan of work. There's been no further changes to the 24/5 plan. This is at Appendix C, and the only changes that have occurred to the 25/6 plan is not to any of the coverage, but just when we started scoping some of the reviews, we've had some requests to just move the timing of some of those reviews to suit operational requirements, which we've sort of happily worked with officers to do that. I think that was it, Chair, in terms of sort of the headlines. Good progress made on the completion of the 24/5 plan, and likewise a good start to the 25/6 plan. Obviously the headline conclusions from those reviews were in the papers as well.
Lovely, thank you very much. Can I just say thank you as well for the work that you've carried out. I think it's a really big step forward. I'm going to open this up again to everybody for any comments or questions. Councillor Shaw.
Thank you. It's a great report. I've been quite looking forward to seeing this and the progress made. It's good to see we've identified some weaknesses. Obviously, weaknesses aren't great, but that's kind of the idea of internal audit. And it's good to see it coming through some of the issues, the governance structure. I know I'm in the overview and scrutiny panel, and we've now have an agenda item section for actions. So, yeah, no questions really, just really pleased with the progress. Thank you.
Councillor Hodgson-Jones.
Yes, sorry. It's good to see that the reports are being completed. It's not very nice seeing a limited assurance report. And when it's on something that's as fairly significant as commercial estates, This is telling me that we don't seem to have the right sort of controls in place. And the risk here is that we're not actually achieving the revenue that we should be achieving because we're not reviewing and upgrading rents as and when they should fall due. I know this isn't a question for internal audit, but I wonder if officers can comment as to how seriously this report is being taken and what action is going to be proposed. I might be further on in the papers on action plan, but I really do think this is something that needs to be addressed urgently and can't just be shoved under the carpet and left to wait.
Michelle.
Actually, if I may come in, Chairman, thank you. And then Suzanne, if you deal with the substantive point around commercial estates. I think Councillor Hodgson-Jones, if I can just pick up the language around there, how seriously our office is taking the report, or are we brushing it under the carpet? I actually take exception to that, because that's the integrity for Suzanne and I. And we take every single report that comes through that identifies weakness absolutely seriously. And that's why many of those reports that are coming through have detailed action plans as well. There is not a single report that will come through here that does not then get dealt with. And whether that's a review of systems, procedures, personnel, capacity, capability, all of that is something that we are all over as the Officer Corps, for sure. So I want to give that assurance to every single member of this committee that any report coming through, and indeed, if I may, some of the proposed areas for internal audit were proposed by Suzanne, myself and the monitoring officer, because of the assurance and seriousness that we take around the internal audit function. So thank you, Chairman. And Suzanne, if I can ask you to pick up the specifics around the commercial estates, please.
Thank you. Before the audit actually commenced, I'd recognised that there was some capacity issues within this team, and we had already put some additional resource in there. And as a consequence of that, we actually presented to corporate leadership team a slightly revised approach about how we segment some of that work, which actually also looked particularly at rent reviews, which is the sort of work which we could readily get some external support with to get those caught up, pushed through relatively quickly. So we have taken some immediate steps to add some strategic resource. We have a recruitment that closed last week, and I'm in the process of shortlisting for a further estates officer, but also looking at alternatives of how we might actually bring some of that forward more quickly to make sure that we are maximising our assets, but more importantly as well, focusing on the need to make sure that we're sure about all of our properties, not least of which to support the valuation work, which Claire was referring to, but our preparations for local government review, which will be absolutely essential that we are clear about the state of our property, the state of the rent reviews and everything else.
Thank you. On that point about the link to valuations, clearly the value of a commercial property is defined by its potential rental income. And if we haven't been upgrading the rent reviews, we would therefore have a knock-on effect on the valuations. So this is work that needs to be treated urgently, because it will have an impact on the accuracy of the closing balances and the valuation of our estate going forward.
I accept that point entirely, and hence why we are taking the action that we are doing, because we're very clear we need to make the most of all of our assets, and do that work with appropriate diligence.
Councillor Gray.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think that particular example shows how quickly things can drift away, because that wasn't the position that portfolio or that particular area was in a few years ago. If I can just elevate myself up to sort of slightly higher levels, there are two areas that I would like Dan to explore with you with regards to further reporting. The first is thank you very much for the outline of what the summary of the key issues from the final reports being presented to the committee. It's good to have a summary, but it's even better to actually see the reports, because you've presumably agreed some management actions with management, but ultimately my understanding is that the management actions need to be held in account to us as a committee. You know, we're the ones who are examining this, and it's this committee ultimately that says whether or not it thinks those management actions are or are not what we would expect to see. So we used to see full reports come through from audit, and I would like to see those reports come through again, because I would like to see what the agreed management actions are. I'm not impugning anything through that. I'm just saying, how are we to do the governance if we're just saying there are 18 management items that are still outstanding? I don't know what they are. I don't know what they look like. And I don't know whether I can work out whether the management actions are appropriate, in my opinion. The rest of you may disagree. Dan may disagree with me, but surely my role here is to express an opinion as to whether they're adequate or they're not. So I would like to, for you to, Dan, to reflect on how without completely overwhelming us with paperwork, you can help us see a little bit more in terms of what the final reports actually look like. For example, home and hybrid working, very interesting topic. Lots of our residents have strong opinions about home and hybrid working for people that they pay the salaries of. It's advisory, I get it's advisory, but what were the outcomes of this? You know, what are the management actions that spring forth from it? We can't see that. The general public can't see that. So I think it's something to just reflect on in terms of the quarterly reporting that we've got here, and have we as a committee got enough visibility to give ourselves confidence that you as internal audit are doing what we would expect you to be doing through there. On the same vein, my second point, Chair, is around risk events. Now, presumably, there is a risk event reporting system that kind of comes through to you and clearly through Suzanne and Michelle. You know, someone falls off the back of a lorry, that's a risk event. You know, somebody does something that they shouldn't do, that's a risk event. The board that I have to report to sees all the risk events. Now, I'm not suggesting in an organisation like this we want to see every single risk event coming through, because we really would probably be inundated at that point, but we've got no real visibility around what they look like. So can you give me assurance that you're seeing them? Stuff's happened, somebody's put their hand up, something's gone wrong here, I need help, this hasn't really worked as it should have done. Is that flowing through to you, Dan, in a way that you would expect it to, as our internal audit lead? And if it is, how can you help us see it?
If I may take the second item first. So I think in terms of the risk event, I mean, I appreciate risk events are probably a different thing to corporate risks or operational risks that I would expect to see on risk registers. So I think if we sort of take them in turn, obviously we've got strategic risks and operational risks that may materialise. Here's a range of controls that we've got in place, and this is how we're mitigating that. We may also see things like risk assessments carried out as part of sort of health and safety arrangements and health and safety reporting. Typically, I would only see those when we carry out audits of governance, where we might be looking at sort of where health and safety is reported to, or where indeed we're looking at a health and safety audit. So that isn't something that I would get regular risk reporting of. That would go, and as I would expect it to, that would go more through to the sort of executive leadership team. And if there are trends and issues through that risk reporting process, we attend some of those executive meetings, and we would expect to be having that discussion around, is the internal audit plan still focused in the right places? Are there concerns or risks that are coming live that we should consider amending our programme of work during the year. So I would say there is that. I think that's the main sort of process in terms of those risk events probably get reported through to senior leadership team, and then through my attendance and Alistair's attendance at those meetings, we would determine whether or not we needed to flex the programme in year to focus on sort of risks that are actually occurring. If I may, in terms of the level of detail on the internal audit reports, I mean, I'm happy to. What I might do is actually take this one away and take this away with Suzanne in terms of looking at this, because I think what I would like to do is just look explicitly at what we're saying, the committee's terms of reference, because I'm conscious that we could inundate you with 6-8 full reports at future meetings, and then it becomes the internal audit committee rather than with respect to sort of the. I'm conscious we could overload you. What there is a programme of work in place to do is every single action that we agree throughout the audit reports goes on the management action tracking log, and then usually what I see on this sort of committee is the committee will then receive regular updates of that log and see overdue actions in priority. And that is the real scrutiny. It's having confidence in the fact that we're agreeing management action. So, for example, on the paper tonight, page 180, I'm saying there that I looked at as a sample of actions. I looked at 18 previously agreed medium priority actions, and I found that 15 of those have been fully implemented and 3 were not quite yet implemented. So that's my sort of independent assessment of whether actions are being implemented in line with the right timelines. But alongside that, officers will have an action tracking report, and typically what I would see at this sort of meeting is on an exception basis. You need to be cited on overdue actions, and in particular overdue actions that are a high priority or overdue actions that were from a limited assurance report. And I think a better use of your time, if I may suggest that, would probably be focusing on the exceptions and trusting the process that we're agreeing with management actions that will mitigate the risks that we find within those individual reports. And then I think on an exception basis, you can understand, have we got significant slippage against actions that have been agreed?
Do you want to come back in? Yep, that's fine. Yep.
So let's start with the one that's freshest in our mind then, the one that you've just answered there. So very happy for you to take that offline and work out something that's appropriate. I think you're getting at what I'm asking here. I suppose the question still stands out there. Who's providing the robust, Michelle, this is not that I don't trust you, but who's the person who's providing the robust challenge to say the agreed management actions are appropriate, they are doing what needs to be done to control the risks out there? Is that the executive councillor? Is that just you as a management team? This is probably more of a question for Michelle than perhaps you, Dan.
I think that's me. I'm not accepting if I'm being told, no, I'm not going to do that, I will come and report to this committee that officers have agreed to accept a range of risks in this area, which I think are unacceptable or exposes you to a level of risk. Now, my experience to date is that has not been the case in the reports that we have been involved in and the reports that we are finalising. We've had a good discussion and debate at sort of debriefing of reports, but I see that as my role actually to uphold my professional standards and challenge sponsors of audits, including with respect Michelle and Suzanne, if we have a difference of opinion.
And if I may come in there as well, Councillor Gray, I would have said exactly the same. It is the internal audit function and the internal audit manager function that holds that in their statutory responsibility. And if we weren't, if we were, to take Councillor Hodgson-Jones, brushing it under the carpet, the statutory function of internal audit would make that not happen. I think and it's the levels of checks and balances that come to the assurance mechanism that are within there. We do also have an internal governance board, which is an officer board, but again, it's which we have RSM attend, both Dan, Alistair, and also Craig from Risk, and we go through a series of issues that, topic areas, and add things that we want to discuss, consider, action plans that might not be subject to an internal audit review, but actually why wait for a review if we think there's something that needs dealing with, reflecting on, because that's proactive assurance and governance, which is what we're doing as well.
Thank you. Oh, can I just ask my second
Oh, sorry.
supplementary?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, sorry. Apologies, Vice Chair. So risk events, going back to the risk events thing, so thank you, Dan, for the answer. So I'm probably going to direct the question towards Michelle, if I may, through you, Chair. So how does, just give me some assurance how the process works. Something goes wrong somewhere in the organisation, probably most days, probably many times most days, if in an organisation as large and complex as this. How do those things filter their way up through the chain to you? And when they get through to you, what's the system whereby, to Dan's point, trends can be identified? To identify a trend, you must record something and be logging something somewhere to say, oh, right, yeah, we've had 15 accidents that have taken place at the swimming pool in the last, month. Something must be going wrong down there. What's going wrong? How does that work? And at what point would you kind of feel that something is so big that you'd be escalating it through to possibly the chair of this organisation, or providing us with some more colour as to what's going on? Because I do feel this is an area which all of these are effectively incidents that take place where risk controls, which we've all agreed, have failed. Now, they failed possibly because of negligence, possibly because of unforeseen circumstances, possibly because it's a new risk that we didn't know anything about. But ultimately, we're here to protect that, aren't we? So when things go wrong, at the moment we have no oversight of how often things go wrong. Are they going more wrong than they were before? And I know we've not reported on this in the past, so this is a new request that I'm making here. I've never seen this before, but I'm subject to pretty severe reporting restrictions about whenever something goes wrong, you put your hand up, you ring up internal audit, and you say, I've got a situation here, I think we can resolve it, but you just need to know that this has happened. So clearly we're doing something different here, and I'm curious, Chair, as to how we as a committee can get some oversight as to how the process is working effectively for you. And Michelle, that is not to, I'm not casting any aspersions through that question. I'm doing what I think I'm here to do, which is to make sure there's a process in place that works.
Thank you, and if I may, Chair. So I've mentioned the governance board that we have, and the members, the officers, that's an internal officer board. We have the statutory officers, the 2 directors, and we also have our head of HR, RSM attend in the internal audit capacity, and we have membership on a case-by-case topic linked to health and safety, safeguarding, and data protection, because all of those areas within them have significant risk. So if I take a hypothetical situation, if there were to be a safeguarding incident, we already have a safeguarding board, which some of you will be aware of, again, which meets on a monthly basis. If there is something that arises through the safeguarding board, which is significant, actually it's escalated from the safeguarding board to the governance board. And we had a meeting, our governance board met, where are we? Monday. And as an example, we talked about safeguarding issues there. We talked about the issues of how that may have arisen, what we could learn from that, how to prevent that and mitigate in future, and actions were taken away from that. So we have a monthly rolling programme of where things are escalated and debated. As part of that, we also take the HR factor, implementing lessons learned from employment matters. So if there are, hypothetically, if we had an employment tribunal matter, which we settled, something along those lines, we would want to see lessons learned there. At what point in the time frame of that could there have been management intervention, or where did we miss something that could have prevented us getting to that point? So that governance board, we also look externally. So we look at what's happening in the world of 114s, best value notices. So a few months ago, Suzanne briefed us on the Barnet situation where a 114 had been issued, which wasn't in relation to the financial affairs, but more of a transactional issue, which related to a lack of, it was the pension fund and incorrect decision making in the organisation. And we tested that. We look at good practice that arises externally. We look at, again, because the monitoring officer is on there, if there's any relevant case law that's emerged that we need to be cited on. So that's a checks and balance. Now, if there was something significant that then needed to, that was so significant it needed escalating, we would look at the subject matter and where does the subject matter of that sit within the organisation. So if I may take an example of perhaps an employment matter. If an employment matter was the subject of that, the correct committee for that in the first instance would be the employment committee, because it owns the functions of the delegations, of the functions of employment, policies, HR, etc. And then at the appropriate time, if that needed to be escalated to full council, we would see that escalated to full council. But that is where we would look at the subject matter would determine whether or not it comes to corporate governance. Now, if it was a specific subject matter as opposed to a level of assurance, because actually everything has assurance in that sense, but some committees or indeed cabinet, if it was an executive function, would have the ownership of the topic area, and we would take it through there first in accordance with the constitution and where matters sit. But again, it's something that we introduce. It's something that we've introduced since I've been here in terms of a formal governance board that has the overview. It is very separate from what you will know and hear of senior management team and corporate management team in terms of which has day-to-day business activity. And the reason we've set aside a separate governance board is so we are focused, and that is the purpose of that meeting in terms of such things as risk assurance, lessons learned, opportunities for constant improving. And where do we do that? And I think the other thing I would say is we're shifting very much the culture so that actually we want people to tell us if something goes wrong, because if we know something has gone wrong, we're able to, again, resolve, reflect, and then put into place good practice and seek to mitigate that from happening again.
So can I say thank you very much for that answer, which is very comprehensive. And, for you, as I say, forgive me for doing it. Our job here is to trust you, but also to verify that these things are taking place as well. So can I just, one final question on that? That sounds excellent. Are those, is a minute of those meetings or actions of that coming out of those meetings recorded somewhere so that an external person coming in and looking at it could see that it was all happening?
So if I may, Chair. Yes, absolutely. They are formally minuted. There is an action log which is checked, which is reviewed in terms of actions arising. And that, again, is part of our due diligence, but it's also about demonstrating in the event something happened, we have an evidence base to be able to demonstrate, again, I can't say a DPO, but take a significant DPO breach where we had to self-refer to the Information Commissioner's Office. Part of our mitigation to demonstrate to the Information Commissioner's Office would be our approach to data protection And one of those areas of evidence would be the fact that on a monthly basis we hear from Adam in terms of trends. So picking up the point of what's coming through in terms of potential breaches, self-referrals, training. Where do we have pockets within the organisation that might be less good at managing data protection, and therefore what do we do in terms of identifying additional training? So our audit trail that exists, and therefore should something ever happen, we can rely on that to demonstrate we have acted reasonably, we have sought to be proactive, and we have sought to give that assurance in terms of a continual learning organisation for HTC.
Councillor Shaw.
Thank you. I think my takeaway from that, I do agree with some of what you said there. I don't think I personally want to read volumes and volumes of reports, but I do think a summary would perhaps be useful. As part of the internal audit committee governance structure, it was recommended there was an agenda item to track progress. Perhaps that's something that could be applied to this committee. Perhaps.
Councillor Jennings, then Councillor Hodgson-Jones.
Thank you, Chair. And it's sort of on a similar vein, really. And Councillor Gray made a point I was going to make about the full reports. I think there must be a middle ground where we can see a little bit more than just the summary that we're seeing. And I'm thinking, really, there are, for example, on the home and hybrid working report, there are 14 recommendations, 2 of which are high priority, and that's sort of been distilled down into 4 bullet points of what that audit has been to us. And I think when I've sat on audit committees of other public bodies before, there's at least been some sort of looking at the high priority action points to see that they are relevant and the response that's being got back from management at the time. So I think if we can get to some sort of point where we can see a little bit more than just an overview of what the audit has found, I'd find that really helpful.
Can I just add to this, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but the managers that are owning each of these particular things are going to be coming along to meetings so that we're going to be able to have that reassurance from them as well. Is that right?
I think that was in the area of risk. What we talked about previously was actually doing deep dive into risk. So actually, you will have the opportunity to see other officers as well and ask them about how they're managing their risk. So that was in relation to risk. What I would say is normal practice in my experience is if the head of internal audit isn't getting traction, they'd report it to this committee, and I would expect the officer concerned to come for them to answer to you as to why that was the case in respect to internal audit actions. So it was risk where we said if you so wish to do some deep dives, we would have relevant officers present, but equally if there are particular actions or something where it's important that the officer is present, that would happen as well. That's my experience.
Councillor Hodgson-Jones. Oh,
Thank you,
sorry, Michelle, do you want to come in on that before we go to you?
Thank you. I was just going to come in on around the home and hybrid working. That will be going to the Employment Committee. That will be an item to report there, again, because the Employment Committee has the function for HR policies. And some of that is around the work we need to do around introducing new policies, and it also links to the workforce strategy work that's being undertaken as well. So there will be clear visibility of that particular audit because it fits under the terms of reference for the Employment Committee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that there are 2 strands here that I want to pick up on. The first is where an internal audit report includes multiple recommendations of particularly high recommendations, because what we get here is we get a table that tells us how many recommendations are made. We have very limited information as to what those recommendations might be or how important they are. And the second stage, I'll come back to that first stage in a moment, but the second stage is the monitoring purpose. And we have discussed in this committee in the past whether we should have regular reports on progress against recommendations and management action. But we've never actually really seen a full report of outstanding actions, agreed actions coming out of internal audit reports so that we can satisfy ourselves that those actions are in fact being addressed. In terms of my experience in other bodies is that you get the report, you don't get the full report, and I agree that we don't want to sit here and sift through hundreds of pages of reports, but where a report has got several high recommendations, high priority recommendations, then we need to know more than just a report was issued with two high priority recommendations. We need to have some idea of what those reports are and what the agreed actions are that should then appear on that regular monitoring report of progress against those actions. You can't monitor progress against something if you don't know what it is you're monitoring against. So you do need those high risk recommendations from the reports to come to this committee, not in massive detail, but just to know what they are and what the agreed actions are. And then we need to see the regular reporting of progress against those actions. And where the red flags do arise is where a recommendation has been sitting awaiting action. And I apologize for my earlier comment, which obviously upset the chief executive, but the reality is I have seen reports where recommended actions are still sitting as recommended actions more than one fiscal year after they were recommended, and in one case more than 3 years after it was recommended. And to me, that strikes as a brush under the carpet. That wasn't this authority, so I'm not criticizing this authority, but I have seen that if you don't have a control system to follow up on the agreed management actions, then they can drift. And it is ultimately the responsibility of the manager involved. But if we don't know who the manager involved in, and there is no robust system for controlling that, then internal audit hasn't got the strength to push for that. And it ultimately falls down on the chief executive and comes to this committee. It's not for this committee to go around banging managers over their head and saying you should have done this. But it's an important part of our function to assure ourselves that those controls are in place and are being used to ensure that recommendations from internal audit do in fact get carried out. And if they're not carried out, there's a very good explanation why that is.
Suzanne, did you want to come in here?
If I may, Chair, fairly early on when I got here, I picked up all of the old outstanding actions, and I think I provided you with quite a comprehensive report, and we closed a number of those out. I then presented that to internal audit, and they have now, which I think is referenced in Dan's comments here, were 15 of the 18. There are 3 remaining, and we are progressing those. What I'd also say is because more recently, with the reports that have been done, all of those actions have been added onto the system, which is called GRC Insight, and we have turned back on, because they did inadvertently, when we'd moved versions, got turned off, the reminders to managers that tell you, and I know because I've had one, because I have something I need to make sure is done by the end of the month, a reminder that your action is coming up due. If you fail to do it, you also get a countdown reminder, and then there's an overdue. What I also know is happening, because we had some system training collectively on this, is that the team are then looking at overdue actions, and we'll escalate that up through into internal audit as well. So bearing in mind what Dan's described to you today, is we've only just finished some of those more recent, those actions are now already loaded and assigned to people, and so there is that system, and from that it is my proposal that it's management's responsibility to update you on internal audit actions. We will then use that as the basis for being able to demonstrate to you that actually this is where they are, this is what they are. And I think Dan's already articulated that he and I, with the governance board, will look at how we actually generate the right reports so that governance board can look at it, and then the necessary elements of that we present in the update of internal audit action progress to this committee. So we will take that away and actively pursue that.
Michelle, did you want to just come in?
If I may, Chair, just a quick one as well. And I think Councillor Gray, Councillor Jennings and Councillor Hodgson-Jones were certainly at my very first meeting that I attended as Chief Exec, which was the Corporate Governance Committee. And there were on that agenda that evening a significant number of actions that had not been completed. And in fact, Councillor Gray, I do believe there may have been one on there that was, I think Councillor Hodgson-Jones, you said not in the fiscal year. I think I might even think it was 2 years outstanding if I think of 36 months, actually. And I can tell you, and I've had that conversation with Councillor Gray, that I was surprised to see that level of actions outstanding. And therefore, I would say that not only is it the system that supports the change of that, and around accountability, which is actually something around when we talk about assurance, we talk about accountability. There are consequences, and that is the language that we use as your senior leadership team when we are working with colleagues in RSM and with our managers as well. And our managers and those teams are embracing the way that we now conduct and undertake internal audit. And in fact, just before Suzanne and I were talking about how the teams are wanting to come forward and put their areas up for internal audit. And that is the change, that is the embracing the value that internal audit brings to continuous improvement and value for money. And I think there is a significant difference in the organisation today than at my very first meeting back in November 23, as it was then. Yes.
Councillor Hodgson-Jones.
Thank you. I just want thank you for that comment, and yes, I do recall that because it was probably one of the meetings where I was griping about the lack of reporting on these controls. Just an observation. I'm not going to pass any comment on this, but an observation. Suzanne mentioned that the outstanding actions have been addressed. Dan mentioned he'd reviewed 18 actions and 15 of them had been addressed and 3 were remaining. On this Appendix A, on page 8 of 27 or 182 of the pack, there are 12 red recommendations and 25 amber recommendations issued by internal audit in the first half of this year. And that actually, and I just want to question, is that the sort of level of recommendation we should be expecting? And does that represent an increase in the number of red and amber recommendations coming out of internal audit? And should we be worried about that?
Michelle.
May I go first, actually, on that, and then I'll see if Dan and Suzanne wish to come in. I think when we were looking at the and working with Dan and Alistair around this year's internal audit plan, Suzanne and I were very mindful that perhaps some areas in the past have not been covered on an internal audit plan as we perhaps with frequency would have expected. And we saw this as an opportunity to add capacity to this year's internal audit plan. With that additional capacity and more internal audits being undertaken, and Suzanne and myself, and indeed Tom, challenging Dan to put us through our paces, I expect to see this year far more recommendations come through, because we have wanted to have that, we have sought that level of transparency and said, right, go in and look at a broader area than perhaps may have been an approach in the past. And I think that's probably all I'll say on that. But perversely, I'm pleased to see the number of recommendations, because it means we are absolutely in the space of continuous improvement. And it means that we are identifying and addressing those, and therefore being more efficient and more effective as an organisation. And even though I suspect it will be painful, because quite rightly you will hold us to account as your senior officers, I would rather be in that position than not. I don't know, Suzanne or Dan, if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, so, well, I've just written down 3 points, actually. I would probably expect to see, certainly in year one, the number of high and medium priority actions to increase. So I think I would agree with Michelle on that point. I don't know the answer to the looking backwards, let's say the last 2 financial years, the split of overall high, medium, low priority actions. Certainly the reports that we've looked at, there was no, and this was one of the points picked up in the sort of the EQA readiness assessment, there was no underpinning explanation of what a high, medium or low action actually meant. So that potentially is difficult to compare. I think the only other point that I would make is that you're in danger of comparing apples with pears in terms of, obviously every year you will be looking at a series of different internal audits. So sometimes you might, it's sometimes difficult to just sort of do that comparison. I would always just give you a health warning if I'm saying this is how this year's plan compares to last year's in terms of opinion levels and number and category of actions. But yeah, I've just answered that as honestly as I can.
I've nothing really to add to that other than, like Michelle, my expectation, as Dan has said, is that actually I'd rather have these actions and that we're dealing with them. And what I can say, because I receive all the final reports, as does Michelle, because that's the nature of our roles. Very often by the time we get some of these reports now, some of those actions have already been done. So actually that does demonstrate that managers are in that learning space. And I would just add that, in fact, Dan and Alistair and the team are actually running a session with managers. What does an audit look like? Who will you expect to see? They're doing it as a team session, so we can record it, so those who aren't here are not. And then Dan and Alistair will be providing them with a bit of an aid memoir of this is what you can expect, this is how you can get yourself prepared. So, and that was something when I offered it, I was expecting people to go, no, we don't want to do that, but actually they were queuing up. So I think that's really positive. So actually in some respects, I think managers are actually wanting to demonstrate they're taking action against some of these things, which does feel positive.
Okay. I'm going to move forward from this item, but the recommendation for this is for us to note the report. Is everyone in agreement that we do that? Yeah. Item 6, draft annual internal audit report 24-25. Dan, I'm going to hand over to you again.
Thank you, Chair. So if I may, page 207 of your papers, obviously the paper itself ordinarily would be providing an opinion on the risk management, governance and internal control arrangements. What I've done, and it sort of lays out in the paper, and I think I sort of laid this out in a couple of progress paper updates I'd given to the committee previously, and certainly when I'd attended some of the exec team meetings, it was clear that we sort of weren't going to be in a position where we could sort of give that full opinion for 24/5. So that's why we see the disclaimer opinion in front of us. And as I've stated there, an opinion on the risk management, governance, internal control arrangements as required by the public sector internal audit standards cannot be provided. And that's because there's been insufficient internal audit coverage in 24/5 that would comply with those standards to in effect conclude on the adequacy and effectiveness of those arrangements. What I would also do is ensure, and part of my role is to make sure that whatever opinion that I provide in here and whatever I'm suggesting gets considered as a significant governance issue flows through to the annual governance statement. And I've obviously done that reconciliation. I've reviewed the draft AGS that's on tonight's agenda. Suzanne, to be fair, had sort of shared it with me ahead of that. So I'm content that that is reflective of my annual report here. The disclaimer opinion, and in particular, if you sort of dig into my report, I actually, so I'm just getting to the page, I flag on page 216 explicitly those issues that I would expect to be considered. So clearly we've pulled out some of the limited assurance, so negative opinions. What we've also pulled out is the disclaimer opinion needs to be referenced, which indeed it is. The issue around compliance with the public sector internal audit standards, again, that's referenced. What I've also referenced within this report, however, and we've sort of obviously had a lot of discussion tonight, is the action that has been taken to address the recommendations that came out of that readiness assessment report. And in effect, that was, as Suzanne, I think, has explained, our appointment. So you will have seen that we've already brought to this committee, I think it was at the March meeting, a completely overhauled internal audit strategy, internal audit plan for 25-6. So a number of those things you've already seen are moving in the right direction in terms of the 25-26 financial year. I've referenced tonight the training that's been provided as well, the fact that RSM complies with the global internal audit standards. I brought that briefing again to the last meeting. We've got that risk-based plan strategy, a good start to the internal audit plan for 25-6. So whilst this is obviously a backward-looking document in terms of the 24-25 arrangements, I have also referenced the how some of those issues have already been addressed and are indeed being addressed in 25-6. And I think, to be fair, you've heard from the Chief Executive and the Section 151 officer tonight that supports that. I've referenced the follow-up work in there that we've carried out. We've also got further follow-up coverage in the 25-6 plan. So the committee will receive more reviews during 25-6 that give you that sort of independent confidence. What else did I want to say? I've stated on page 219, obviously it didn't apply to the whole of the last financial year, but I have pulled out that sort of statement of conformance with the internal auditing standards that you will get with having sort of RSM as your provider and overseeing the work of the in-house team. And then Appendix A, which I think is hopefully self-explanatory, that is a list of all of the reviews that were undertaken in the 24-5 financial year, whether it was delivered by RSM or the in-house team, the relevant opinion that was issued, and a summary of all those actions. I've also, for completeness, incorporated the list of audits that were deferred from the 24-5 plan and some of the specialist audits that were originally in the plan but weren't ultimately commissioned. At Appendix B, I'm not sure, I don't think this is the first time you've seen it, but these are the 4 different opinions that you will receive through all of our reports that come through to this committee in the future. So page 224. So you'll become familiar with those, obviously, as we bring our final reports through. But what I may just do is leave that one pager in all of my progress reports just as a reminder to the committee what the respective opinions are. So clearly this is a backward-looking document in terms of the arrangements for 24-5. It's a disclaimer opinion, but I have tried to incorporate some of the action that's already been taken to address some of those issues when we have more of a sort of forward-looking lens on the position. But as stated at the beginning, I am content that the right messages from my annual report have flowed through to the annual governance statement.
Thank you. Any comments or questions? No? Councillor Gray?
Yeah, so thank you very much for that. I think it's really helpful to put those, you've obviously now got 4 levels of assurance that you're going to provide to us. I think that'll be helpful. And obviously this year we just have to kind of make some translation as to what limited assurance may or may not mean in your world. can I just ask the question, only because it's the one that kind of really leaps out? By the way, I agree that you know, the governance statement that we approved earlier does, as I said, think at the time, address some of the issues or address the issues adequately. The thing, the limited assurance items that you specifically brought out there, key financial controls, code of procurement, one leisure pool operations, and commercial estates, which we've already talked about. Is this a snapshot of where we were on the 31st of March? Or is this a sort of more recent snapshot as to where we are with sort of outstanding actions and things that have been done and things that have not been done?
So those 4 limited assurance opinions were issued at different points of the financial year within, so they could also have been potentially testing transactions from as early as Q1 in the financial year. So that was the position of the report at the time the final report was issued. What you perhaps have to overlay with that is the latest management action tracker. That's why what we do state within our annual report is, here's all of the things that we think should be considered as significant governance issues, but management need to look at that alongside the progress that has been made in implementing the actions when formulating the annual governance statement. So it does allow an opportunity to say, well, that was at a point in time. So at Q1, it was a limited assurance opinion. Management's assessment is all of those actions have been implemented now. It was a that was the position. I think, to be fair, yeah, so those reviews were at a point in time. It gets quite difficult in an annual governance statement to obviously refer to every single report and where the position is. I think often that's covered by, there's a management action tracking process in place and assurances received through that process that actions agreed are implemented.
So just a supplementary comment that either Michelle or Suzanne may wish to comment back on then. So the pool operation and One Leisure in general, which we haven't actually talked about One Leisure at all this evening, it's not really registered anywhere else in terms of what we've been talking about. But clearly there are some significant actions here. Pools are, you know, inherently quite dangerous places through, you know, water and chemicals. And obviously One Leisure is a complicated business that, you know that better than I know that. So when I read, you know, there are 289 actions recommended from the health and safety audits that were taking place across there, in line with some comments that have been made elsewhere. I've no idea, Michelle, whether 289 actions is a great outcome, a reasonable outcome, or a poor outcome. But it would be helpful, whilst I appreciate this is not strictly in line with what we're doing here, but given that it's the first time One Leisure's kind of cropped up this evening, are you able to kind of give us some reassurance that, yes, this was written at a point in time, but I'm all over this, and, you know, you don't need to worry, committee, because management actions have dealt with this, and the 289 actions are, you know, gone?
If I may, Chair, I don't have that level of detail with me tonight, but I will get a written response to the. I will ensure a written response to the committee.
Thank you. Any last comments? No? Okay, so on this item, again, this is to note and accept the draft annual internal audit report. Is everyone happy? Yeah. Thank you. Moving on to item 7, Corporate Governance Committee Progress Report. Rob, I'm going to hand over to you for you to share the content.
Thank you, Chair. You have a progress report in front of you. You'll see it's been updated since the meeting in March, but happy to take any comments or questions from the committee.
Is there anything from anyone? Councillor Gray.
So just a question really for the Chief Executive before the lights go out, or as the lights go out. The Constitution Working Group, which has been, it's all gone a bit quiet really on the Constitution Working Group, but we've got a new date in the diary, and 26th of June is happening. but clearly the world is moving very, very quickly with regards to LGR. Is it going to sort of outpace the pace of the Constitution Working Group? And you know, how do you see that group's work playing into the future of Huntingdonshire, wherever that may ultimately end up to be?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Gray. Two parts to the answer. The first is I think there are still things that we need to address because on current government timescales, Huntingdonshire will still be fully operational until the 1st of April 2028. So therefore, if there are elements within the Constitution that need to be addressed as a priority, then that should most certainly be addressed because that's around good governance and actually making sure decision making is effective. The second point around where will that feed into, as Chief Exec, I head up the Governance, Democracy and Risk project group that sits under LGR. I know, I must have been very naughty in a past life. But one of the things that, so I chair effectively a group of monitoring officers. So therefore, one of the things that we are at the moment looking at decision making, consistency across, so just around decision making to get to November. We have also had a session on risk in terms of sharing what we are doing in HDC, but with our colleagues across those 7 constituent organisations, including us. And the third element, I've said that once we have submitted in November, we then need to turn our attention to constitutions. Because if the MOs are starting to be in that space, whilst we won't know until government's decision what constituent councils will form the new unitaries, there is still some definite work that the collection of monitoring officers can be doing in order to identify commonality, areas of priority, which existing members from each constituent council will be focused on. There is also something around, I think, the work revisiting the model constitution that was issued as part of the Local Government Act 2000 and seeing how relevant that is and what we need to be doing, because we need to go back to the starting point of the Local Government Act 2000. And thereafter, once we've got the constituent councils within the new unitaries, I anticipate that group will then split into the 2 unitary groupings, and then those 2 groups will continue then to support the constituent councils, which will lead us then nicely into the shadow board that will come into effect through elections on the 1st in May 27. And then I would anticipate there is a working group of members from each of the constituent councils of the new unitary that would be working towards a common constitution ready for approval on, as one of the priorities of the shadow board, ready for vesting day on the 1st of April 28.
Councillor Gray.
So if I could, Chair, so on the thank you very much for that. On the first point, given that the working group on the Constitution has been sitting for the better part of a year now, are you going to? Can we sort of ask that if things are so important that they need to be done before 2028? Can I suggest that we sort of pick up the pace in terms of working out what those important things are, focusing on those important things and getting them through to this committee so we can recommend them through to council? Is that a reasonable suggestion?
I completely agree.
Yep.
And I think one of the helpful opportunities for our new MO, although Suzanne, I've got a long list for her, but actually it is to be able to own that, because that is the link then to this committee and then the link into, and that's not to say that Tom doesn't have that link, but one of those things that we identified through those earlier peer challenge reports is the capacity around having a monitoring officer full-time for Huntingdonshire. And I think that's certainly something that we will be able to then add the capacity to deliver that outcome as well. So agreed.
Thank you. Councillor Hodgson-Jones.
Thank you. Very interested to hear what you've said so far on this subject. We had a session of the CPCA Audit and Governance, not a full committee, just an informative meeting yesterday, and we have our full committee tomorrow. One of the things that I'd like to flag early up is that when we start resolving the new unitary structures and the constitution for the unitary structures, and we undoubtedly move from 7 councils to 2 councils, that has an immediate knock-on impact on the constitution of the CPCA, and no work has as yet been done on that to even think about what those implications are. And I just wondered whether your Chief Executive Officers Group was aware of that implication and whether there is a plan to deal with that.
Thank you, if I may. So the monitoring officer from the Combined Authority sits within the group that I chair. So therefore, the discussions that we have and will have around constitutions, he will be fully cited so he can take those actions required back into the Combined Authority.
The point being that it will have some implications for the unitaries as well, because their constitutions and how they feed into the CPCA, it's a two-way process. And so for as a specific example, the committees on in CPCA are drawn as one member or 2 members from each constituent. Well, 2 members of the Audit and Governance Committee is certainly not going to be enough going forward.
If I may, thank you. And that's exactly that's the level of detail we will need to explore. One of our challenges at the moment is it's the phasing of when we do that work, and we have agreed that the work on the constitution is best placed to start after we have submitted, so we've then got a clear run of priority, because the decisions will have been made, the risks will have been established, and then are part of each constituent council. Each constituent council has its own risk register, but what we're trying to do is make sure we've got a commonality of approach across the constituent councils, so we've got that consistency. And that's where, once we get to November, that level of detail we can start exploring around, and for my phrase I use is unintended consequences. But just again, as part of that level of assurance for you, we have had RSM do a presentation to my group specifically around lessons learned for LGR in the broader sense, as well as around risk, so that we have that knowledge and insight that we are feeding back into our own organisations.
Thank you.
Any final comments? No? Okay, well, thank you everybody for your input and contributions this evening. And with that, I will now declare the meeting closed.